Thanks for joining us for another Gray Sheet Visual Podcast. I'm Sean Schmidt, Editor-at-Large. Joining us today is Cap Yildrix, a former longtime FDA staffer. Cap began his career at FDA in 1978 as an investigator, a position he held for 9 years before moving to CDRH, where he worked on a host of medical device issues until his retirement in 2010. This is Cap's third podcast with the Gray Sheet, and we're delighted to welcome him back, this time to offer tips and advice to ensure that your complaint handling system is healthy and stays that way. Take it away, Cap.
Well, I want to thank everybody for looking at this podcast, and we're going to be dealing with one of my favorite issues, and that's a firm's complaint system. I've always seen that as a firm's Achilles heel, because that's where the bad news happens. So let's go on to talking about the initial issues. First, companies have to accept, just as FDA does, that bad things happen. The point with that is that you have to deal with them. You can't pretend that it doesn't exist. You can't go into denial. You can't pretend that you have Harry Potter's invisibility cloak. That no longer works. It did in the 70s, but not anymore. So the next thing to understand are the ABCs of risk to health. Risk to health runs through all of FDA's post-market programs. And so the post-market program is intended to identify a risk to health, and then it's looking to see what you're going to do about that. So with the ABCs of a risk to health, it starts out with dealing with medical device reporting and whether or not a device may cause a serious adverse health consequence or death. The other tier with that for MDRs is that a malfunction may cause or contribute to a serious adverse health consequence or death. So that sets up the individual event in terms of, oh, a bad thing happened. The next thing in terms of an ABC, or you could look at this as a B, are concerned about is there a reasonable probability that a device will cause a serious adverse health consequence or death. That's how you begin to look at things in terms of recall, in terms of reasonable probability. It's a forward-looking statement. The other thing that you need to include in that is that the device may cause temporary or irreversible serious adverse health consequences. So, it's sort of interesting to look at that. So you have may cause serious adverse health consequences or a malfunction that can do that. In this case, for recalls, there's a reasonable probability that that will happen. And then to set aside, it may cause temporary or reversible serious adverse health consequences. The thing that slips in here is you can't reverse death, so that's sort of taken out. The other thing is that with that kind of probability, firms usually want to take an abundance of caution in terms of what they're going to do about that. That's evidenced in the last category of there's a probability of serious adverse health consequences, even if it's remote. So it's like the stars have to align before something bad's going to happen. But you know what? When all of those things come together, something bad happens, and even FDA thinks something should be done. It's like 5 things have to come together for you to say, oh, the bad things happen. I've seen that to be the case. The one thing about this, in terms of how you look at it, is you have to own the problem. You can't deny that it's going on. It's sort of like you're in deep denial, then you need counseling in terms of your dysfunctional perspective. You have to face reality. So in the case of dealing with complaints, particularly in terms of reporting to FDA, if some cases the firm has to report in 5 days, if that's what FDA wants. In the most typical case, that you have 30 days to report the event. Now, what's curious or interesting or important about that 30 days is that for medical device reporting, when any employee is aware of the event, or if there's a manager with qualified background and they can see into the future that there may be a bad event, that the company has to take responsibility and the clock starts then. So any employee or a qualified person who can see into the future. Now, what's important, I think is really important, at least for me, is when it says any employee, that includes salespeople. Salespeople usually are not tuned in to the medical device reporting regulation. So any employee, i.e. salespeople, that's important. What's out of that in terms of anybody in the firm who looks at the problems is that the risk to health factor is really important. And so you have to find out what's really involved. So let's get into, how you find out what's really involved in terms of what we're going to talk about next for handling complaints. So generally that's looked at as what goes on with the quality system regulation in terms of complaint handling. So what you need to look at first in terms of what you do, and we can see that on the next slide, is who's investigating the problem. That's really important because the person has to know that job. So firms that have, a lot of devices or any device, they need to have a multidisciplinary approach, a lot of different types of brain power coming to that evaluation. For example, you may need a chemist, you may need a clinical affairs person, the product designer, manufacturing, all of those kinds of things. When they're looking at it, you don't want to have it happen to one after the other. They all should be working at the same time. That should be a team concept. Also with that, you want a process chart to show who is responsible for taking the next step. That may be including someone on the team, or then who's going to be fixing it, or who's going to be doing design work. That has to happen. The next thing is that you need a record of the evaluation that you're doing. That's really important in terms of, is there a third-party expert? Did somebody visit the consumer about that? In order to do that, you have to make sure that you have somebody who has the knowledge, skills, ability, and background to pick it up from the team, and even within the team, to know how to take it to the next step, to gather the information you need for the complaint, and which may drift over into medical device reporting when something bad happens. So the next thing is you need some practical management in terms of how to keep things moving forward. The other issue is this kind of stuff doesn't go away. So the mantra you need is there a risk to health? Where is it going in the future? There's a sort of a reality check with this in terms of what's important, because you have a public image issue and you have product liability that can happen very quickly in terms of what's important to you and important to FDA. So it's worth getting into, what happens with the firm and what happens with FDA. So in the next issue, after you're looking into a complaint, the next slide talks about, bad things happen with a complaint in terms of a risk to health. So that's what the medical device reporting regulation is about. Tell FDA the bad things that happen. They don't care about the incidental, like the labeling's wrong, or we have this wrong code on it, or the wrong address. That's not involving a risk to health. So when you're identifying a risk to health, the first thing is you have to have sufficient information about what happened. When something comes in and it's like, the device didn't work and it happened on this day, and that's all, the reporter says. It's important to understand that a lot of information needs to be collected. So where is the first place that information is coming in? Is it a complaint desk? Do they have a specific set of questions that they know they need to ask so to get that MDR reporting up and running? The issue too is that does the sales force have the capacity to begin to collect that information? That's where a lot of complaints start. And I don't think people understand that that's when the clock starts, and that's when you can get the most valuable information. Now, out of that, in terms of somebody just reported and the clock starts, and then the 30-day clock is ticking, and you're not sure whether or not to report because you don't have enough information. So companies have this sort of existential quandary about should they report to FDA or not. Let me clear that up right away. Not meeting your 30-day deadline is important and serious. So whatever you have, report that to FDA, and then say in the comment section what your follow-up is going to be or what your timeline. What are you going to say to explain yourself or promise something to FDA? Now, the new hurdle for people in reporting to FDA on medical device report is sending the report in electronically. So people are submitting things to the electronic medical device reporting system. FDA is no longer accepting paper. It has to be electronic. And that begins shortly. That begins next week, a week from today, August 14. And let me tell you right now, it takes about 2 weeks to even set up that program. So if you haven't started, you're sort of behind the 8 ball. Get going. You have to sort of identify yourself with FDA, get an authenticated account, and then the company has to figure out how it's going to do that. Let me suggest that firms who are going to be large volume reporters, you have a high volume of medical device reports, you may want to have more than one account so that you can get the complaints in easily. It's sort of like when you go to the bank and you have to wait in line and there's only one teller to do the transaction. That's not going to work with you because you have a 30-day time deadline. You can't go in, and expect things to move smoothly either. One of the hooks with this is that the information has to be accurate. If the information is not accurate for whatever the requirements are, the electronic gateway will just refuse your submission. So if it's not right, it's going to get kicked back, and then you have to get things corrected. And the original 30-day time clock is still ticking. It does not reset that. So it's sort of like when that happens, FDA becomes the wicked witch of the West. And you're sort of like the munchkins trying to avoid, some of the fire that she's going to throw. So make sure that you understand how that's doing and make sure you understand that you're going to get in under that 30-day time deadline. So now that we've talked about, the obligations of reporting really bad things that have a risk to health, reporting that to FDA, and now knowing that you have to do that electronically, let's move on to the next issue in terms of FDA and complaints in terms of your follow-up in terms of now what you have for events or a number of events, what you're going to do about it. So let's go on to the next slide in terms of corrections and removals. So remember, we talked about bad things happened, and then the quality system regulation says you should investigate that in a timely and thorough manner. And then once you've done that, if there's a risk to health or a really bad thing, then you have to report that to FDA. That's medical device reporting. Then if you decide to do something about it, i.e. recall, then you go into the next regulation, which is called corrections and removals, or basically cleaning up the mess. So what you need to look at in terms of what's behind the complaint and what's involved with the correction or removal, the first thing is what's your corrective and preventive action. And that's part of a company's CAPA program. That stems out of quality system regulation, but then the idea becomes in terms of risk to health, how are you going to identify that and stop it from happening again? The big issue with FDA is it's always looking at companies that don't get it the first time and have a reiteration of the same kinds of problems. That doesn't work out. And so companies need to understand that when it comes to corrections and removals, it's a matter of getting it right the first time, pay the piper then, or clean up the messes again in terms of a recall. That becomes very expensive. That affects your customer relations. That affects how your stockholders may feel about you. That may affect current product rollouts. And it also can affect, product liability suits. In some way, in terms of a firm's consequences for something bad that happens, FDA is one thing, but then you have to worry about other legal issues that are just as important, and certainly your legal counsel will reinforce that concept. So if you don't manage these problems regarding a risk to health, FDA is sort of like the wicked witch of the West, and she'll go right after, or it will go right after your Achilles heel. That's your weak point, and that's where it goes, because your system, your quality system, your way of dealing with the risk to health has tripped you up. And so FDA, in its enforcement role, its public health obligation, is going to take that. It's sort of like, okay, you tripped up. Here comes the Wicked Witch of the West, and you tripped, and she's taking those ruby slippers. No longer are you going to have your foundation that you've had as a company. That's going away. No more clicking the heels and saying everything is okay. So I hope that is helpful for people. And the one thing I want to remind you is that, again, the electronic medical device reporting regulation becomes effective next week. And if you haven't started, do it now because you're already behind the 8 ball. And FDA has some guidance documents on that, and they just take you through step by step by step. And when you look at that, you'll see that it's very complicated. So with that, I hope that sort of puts into a quick framework how FDA looks at complaints and in terms of risk to health and how that evolves through complaints and then into MDRs and then into corrections and removals. And now with the important part of electronic medical device reporting, that's where it's at right now. So I hope you got something out of that, and thanks for tuning in.
Well, thanks for the great presentation, Cap, as always. And thank you for listening at home, the office, or wherever you may be. And remember to check out our other podcasts at thegraysheet.com.